Sometimes we quilters want a way to make our starts and stops be invisible and absolutely beautiful. Tying and burying thread tails is a great way to do that. I'm Susan Smith. Welcome to my studio, Stitched by Susan. I love to pull back the curtain on some of the projects that I'm working on and show you some of the steps and processes that I use to achieve a really professional result with my machine quilting. And one of them is this idea of tying and burying thread tails to make the starts and stops of your stitching be practically invisible. Now, it isn't practical all the time because often speed is more important. But when you want a perfect show quilt or it's something extra special on a quilt, that might be a time to use it. So let's have a look at how tying and burying is done. You know, those of you who watch me often know that I frequently do this lock stitch at the beginning and end of stitching like this. Stitching along, do a couple stitches in close succession, lock, 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 and call it good, right? I'll just take my bobbin thread, pull it up, trim my thread tails away, and I call that good enough. But what happens when you're doing something like a monogram, like this S, or someone's name, or just you're doing a really fancy quilt for a show and you don't want those lock stitches to show? What can you do with them then? Well, let's stitch another S and we'll look at how to tie and bury invisibly your tails of thread. So I'm not going to do lock stitches at the beginning. I'm just going to hang on to my thread tails and start my stitching. Okay, so here's my pretty S for my monogram, and I'm going to stop my stitching, and that's it. And the only additional stitch I'll take is to pull up that bobbin thread, and I want to make sure I have long tails. So I've got my bobbin loop here, okay, and I'm going to get my finger in there and hang on to it, move my machine away so that I can pull out some excess thread and get some nice long loops, 4 or 5 inches at a minimum. And now we'll move the machine out of the way again. So now I've got a thread tail at the end of my stitching and a thread tail at the beginning of my stitching. Enter my secret weapon. This is a spiral eye, or often called a self-threading needle. And the side of the eye of the needle has a little slit in it so that I can literally run my needle across my threads and they pop into the eye and it's threaded. Can you see that? So this is really helpful when you want to tie and bury these threads, because how difficult would it be to try and feed those threads into the eye of a needle? So instead, we're going to tie a knot, and then we're going to use our little self-threader. So I tie a knot in this way. I'm going to park the needle there. I wrap around my 2 fingers and pull the slot of the tail between them, and then I use my needle to slide off that knot. You can do that part however you want, but what's helpful is in the loop of the knot, if you use the tip of your needle and put it right down where your last stitch is, and then pull gently against the needle, that knot will form right against your fabric. Now we're going to thread the needle, just like so, and we're going to go back into our quilting fabric at the last stitch. And now my needle is between the layers of my quilt. So it's somewhere in the batting, and it doesn't matter if it's above or below or through the batting. Does matter that you don't go through the bottom of the quilt, right? So my needle is between the layers. I'm just going to move it along till I have a stitch, at least a 1/2 inch long, and come back up the top. Now pull my tails, and my knot is right there. I'm just going to give a little tug, and it slides right in between those layers of fabric. So now my thread tails are knotted, but that knot is inside. Nobody can see it. And there's a little tail the length of my stitch. So now I can trim those tails next to the fabric, and I've got an invisible ending. So let's do it again with our beginning thread so you can see it one more time. So now let's do it with our beginning tails as well. So however you want to form that loop, but what's important is that you take the needle into the loop and press the point of it down right at your last stitch. Where is it? Oh, there it is. So that's where your knot forms. Gently pull those tails all the way through. They're long ones in this case. But now my knot has formed around the needle right at the base of that stitching. Perfect. Thread my needle with that trusty spiral eye. And I want both threads in it because it saves time, right? My needle's threaded now. Back in right where that first stitch began. Travel somewhere between the layers of the quilt, between the top and the bottom layer through that batting for at least a 1/2 inch. Depends on how long your needle is, but at least a 1/2 inch, and then come up through the top. Pull your tails through, and if you need to, you can give it a little tug, but that little knot will feed right through between all the layers of the fabric and be invisible. And now you can trim those tails closely. Neat as a pin, tying and burying your thread tails.